All right, guys, welcome back. If you're here today, it's because you need to get some information about the time period right after the Civil War known as Reconstruction. There's going to be two videos in the set. The first one will be about Reconstruction, its beginnings, and the second video, which is forthcoming, will be the end of Reconstruction. So if you need them both, you can watch them both. If not, just start with the first one. So let's get it going. The time period of Reconstruction lasted from 1865 to 1877. So 1865, the Civil War is over. The second part in American history after that war will be we have to rebuild the nation, and that time period is exactly that, Reconstruction. There is an abrupt reason for its ending in 1877. We're going to deal with that later on in that second video called The End of Reconstruction. So the first thing you have to know is there's pretty much two goals to this part of this time period. And that is, number one, rebuild the southern states. So when you look at the devastation, this I believe here is Richmond, Virginia, those buildings, the railroads, the businesses, they need to be rebuilt. The second part of Reconstruction is how do you restore the Union? What do you do with those 11 states that seceded? Bring them back into the country. How do you reform the Southern economy and take all those people who were not part of the American government before and bring them back in? So without further ado, let's get it going. The definition for Reconstruction is there. You can pause that if you need it. So let's look at the plans. Okay, there's going to be three different plans for this. The first, obviously, will be the President Abraham Lincoln. So we're going to go over his plan. The second plan that's actually thought of or not even put into place, but it's part of what we might do, would be Andrew Johnson, who takes over after Lincoln is assassinated. And then there's a group of people known as the Radical Republicans, and they are headed by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner, and they will devise their own plan for Reconstruction. So here we go. Let's start with Lincoln's plan. All right. Number one, he believed the southern states actually didn't have the right to leave. They never left the Union. So you don't have to come up with some glorious plan to bring them back. He did not believe in secession, and he didn't believe they actually left. So really what he's going to do is make this plan very easygoing on the South. And the first part of it's pretty nice. It shows that. He is going to pardon any Southerner who swore oaths of loyalty to the United States. So even though those people committed treason, they could have been arrested, some of them could have been put in jail, some of them could have been killed, Lincoln is willing to offer them a pardon as long as they say, my allegiance is with the United States and I'm sorry. That's pretty lenient, all right? He basically said any of those states could come back. There's no penalties as long as 10% of the Southern voters in that state would take that oath. Really, 90% of the state could be telling Lincoln that they didn't care about him, and Lincoln actually did not care. If 10% said they were sorry, he would let them back in. Lincoln's plan is clearly known as the 10% plan. Now, very easygoing, nice plan. He's willing to give the South a big hug. His plan is never carried out because of his assassination in April of 1865. So Lincoln's plan is really easy, but we don't use it. So, income, this is kind of like a little showing you, right? They must swear the oath of loyalty to the United States. He's willing to offer amnesty, which is that pardon, and they must agree to the 13th Amendment, which made slavery illegal. So, well, who steps in as the vice president, who becomes president upon Lincoln's assassination? That is Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson, what you really need to know about him is he comes from the South, so he really does not want to punish his own people. So Johnson was from the South, Tennessee to be exact, okay? He really is going to follow Lincoln's plan of being very easygoing, pardoning many of the high-ranking Confederates, and his plan is kind of like Lincoln's, but that's pretty much all that's needed to know because we don't use Johnson's plan either. Both Lincoln and Johnson are running the country, but they're not making the rules. Who is making the rules? Congress. So there's a group of people known as Radical Republicans. They are the ones that controlled Congress, and they want really harsh terms for the South. Basically, in plain language here, they want to punish the South as much as they can. All right. Johnson did not consider these views and tries to block these plans, what the Radical Republicans want to do. And you're going to see that through the amendment process, and you're going to see what the Radical Republicans actually do to the South. Right. Later on, Congress actually impeaches Andrew Johnson for violating a law they knew he would break, and that is the 10-Year of Office Act. Johnson is impeached. He is charged. He He does not become found guilty, so he does not get kicked out of the presidency. But this kind of event shows us the battle between the presidency and Congress during Reconstruction. He was acquitted. Acquitted means that he did not do anything wrong and he was not guilty, but really his political power after that impeachment was for naught. It was pretty much gone. So let's find out what really happened. All right. The 10-year of office act was what Andrew Johnson broke, which led to his impeachment, and he really fired this guy, Edwin Stanton. Congress said you can't fire him. He did it anyways, and therefore he was impeached. All right. If you need that vocab for radical Republicans, it's right there for you. Let's deal with what really happened, and that is, I'm going to call it radical Reconstruction here. Who's doing this? The radical Republicans. So these are a group of people, once again, controlled Congress, and they were the ones who dictated the terms for Reconstruction because they made the rules. So the first thing they did was they divided the South into 5 military districts. Why? So they can keep an eye on what was going on down south. So this is how the federal government used the United States Army during this time period to make sure everybody down south followed the rules. All right. Each state down south had to set up a new state constitution, had to set up a new state government, and they had to ratify the 13th Amendment, basically guaranteeing that they would not have slavery anymore. All right. All new state governments were required to grant African Americans the right to vote. Southern states also had to ratify the 14th Amendment. I'll go over those amendments for you in a moment. And former Confederate officials, if you held a position of power down south, you were not allowed to hold public office. All those government jobs were taken away from you. Why? Well, you made a mistake the first time, and these radical Republicans weren't going to let you have power again. All right. Once again, if you start looking at every one of those bullet points there, those are much harsher terms on the South. And if you take a look at my little map here, what are we looking at? 5 military districts. The radical Republicans wanted to keep the military down south to keep an eye on those white Southerners to make sure they were following the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Okay. Now, how did those state governments look during Reconstruction? Well, they have to rebuild themselves. So white Southerners actually wanted local control to limit the freedom and movement of former slaves. But what the radical Republicans are going to do is they are going to insist that those Southern Democrats were not allowed to hold public office because they knew what they would do to those newly freed men. So this was part of the radical Republican plan. Once again, very harsh upon the South. Many Republicans headed these new governments and were supported by African Americans. Remember, the Republican Party was the party that kind of came out of the North, the Abolitionist Party, Lincoln's party, and they're really going to take control of the South during the time period of Reconstruction. After this time period, the Democrats, the local governments down south, will actually reinstitute their control of those states. But during Reconstruction, Republican governments pretty much head up those southern states. Now, is the South happy about that? No, right? Obviously, they're not happy that they lost control of their local governments, and we don't have slavery anymore. We have these freedmen, and those Southerners are absolutely mad, right? So white Southerners who were active in these new governments were branded as scallywags. Why? Because they were Republican. All right. Most people, if you were a good Southerner, you were a Democrat. Well, these new governments are all loaded up with all these Republicans, some of them from the North. So if you were a Southerner who was working in one of these government jobs, who was working with these Republicans, you were branded a scallywag. All right. It's kind of a negative nickname for a Southerner who's a Democrat, Southerner who's a Republican during Reconstruction. The other group of people who were Northerners, who were Republican, who ran down south to get those government jobs, those people were called carpetbaggers. So both of these terms are negative terms for people who were working in the governments down south during Reconstruction. So there's kind of a picture of a carpetbagger. And they got the name because it was said that they took a carpet, they sewed it up on 3 sides, and they put all their belongings down in there, and they ran down south, right? So if you need the vocabulary for scallywag or carpetbagger on your worksheets, you can take time and pause it and put those in. Let's talk about the amendments, all right? These amendments are the Civil War Reconstruction Amendments. Why do we call them that? Because they took place during the Civil War and during the Reconstruction time period. There are going to be 3 of them, all right? The first one you absolutely should know at this point in time. The 13th Amendment happened at the end of the Civil War. It absolutely abolished slavery in the United States. There was no more slavery in this country. So Abraham Lincoln didn't free all the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation didn't free all the slaves. What does free all the slaves is the 13th Amendment, okay? Obviously, after that, we have the 14th Amendment. And this is the grab bag amendment that really the radical Republicans created to kind of make sure that African Americans were going to be treated equally. So when we look at it, it says a couple things. Number one, it says that African Americans are citizens. So the first thing it does is define citizenship. The second part of that says, hey, all these people who are now citizens, they are going to be treated equally under the law. So every citizen in this country gets equal protection under the law. Great amendment. Later on in time, other groups are going to use the 14th Amendment. What groups? Women use it. Minority groups use it. Gay organizations use it. Disabled Americans use it. Why? Because it's pretty clear. It says, hey, if I'm a citizen, I don't care how far I'm different from you, I am supposed to be treated equally. And if I'm not, someone in this country is violating my 14th Amendment equal treatment protections. Okay? Finally, in 1870, towards the end of Reconstruction, our Congress pushes forth what's known as the 15th Amendment that said all African American males have the right to vote. It gave voting rights to African American men. So these 3 kind of go together. And if you want to really do well on things like exams and tests, you should study the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. I can guarantee one of them or all 3 of them will show up on some type of test. Okay? Let's talk about the ugly. Oh, I'm sorry, I make a full rhyme to remember. This is pretty good. So in 13th Amendment, in 1865, slavery was no longer alive. Could help you. Number 14, the 14th Amendment. In 1868, all men are citizens in every state. You just make a rhyme. 8 state, 5 no longer alive. And then finally, the 15th Amendment. In 1870, they wrote, all men in the United States have the right to vote. Right? 1870, they wrote, right to vote. The only people not so happy about that right now are those white Southerners who now they know black men can vote, and women, because women feel maybe they should have been included in that 15th Amendment, and they were not. Right? Now, let's deal with the last. There's some ugly parts to Reconstruction that we have to unpack and get through. All right? Ulysses S. Grant was a president during Reconstruction. Before that time period, he was a Union war hero. He was the general of the Union troops who accepted the surrender of Ulysses S. Grant. I'm sorry, who accepted the surrender of Robert E. Lee, the Southern general. So he's a big war hero, and what do we know about war heroes? They tend to become president. So his presidency, though, is marred. Marred means it's scarred. It's not right. There are things wrong here by scandals. So I'm going to go through these 3 scandals with you, and we're going to leave it off at that until we go to the end of Reconstruction. But this dude right here, Ulysses S. Grant, great general, not so great as president, because these things actually happened right under his nose. Maybe he was even a part of it. Okay, so here we go. The first one is this French company, this Crédit Mobilier scandal. And what it was is very simple. Railroad officials really took a lot of government money, bribed members of Congress to block the investigation. So instead of rebuilding railroads like they were supposed to be doing, they took the money, didn't do the work, and then they paid off these congressmen to get around it. Now, if President Ulysses S. Grant was a good leader, he would have put a stop to that, and we know from history that he did not. Okay? The salary grab. Congress basically gave themselves a 50% pay raise and added 2 years of back pay. Public outcry was fierce. They said this is all they did. These lawmakers got together and just gave themselves a raise. Well, who actually was part of that, or who let it happen? Ulysses S. Grant. So that kind of gave the government a real black eye here. That doesn't like that. That's something maybe you shouldn't be doing. This is kind of the grossest example. During Reconstruction, there was a tax on whiskey. Now, the whiskey distillers, instead of paying the tax, they paid off the tax collectors, and that is called graft. All right. So the tax collectors, instead of going to these distilleries and collecting a tax for the government like they were supposed to, they went to the distilleries, they collected money, but they put it in their pocket. All right, so graft is when you use your job for personal benefit. And there was a ton of money being stolen under that whole whiskey ring. And of course, who could have put an end to it? Who's running the country? Ulysses S. Grant, right? So this is kind of a joke against Ulysses S. Grant. This is him. This is a barrel. And here's a bunch of scandals, right? The Belknap scandal, the press ring, the Indian ring, the whiskey scandals. And he's like up here, he's like, well, I'm going to get to the bottom of this. Well, really, there's so many scandals going on, he'll never get to the bottom of it. So when we go back, we can say that his presidency is marred or marked or labeled by what? A bunch of scandals. All right. There's a question at the end of the sheet about the amendments. Make sure you answer it. Make sure you go back and review this material so you can do well. And stay tuned for the next video, which will be on the end of Reconstruction. Okay, this right here is a great political cartoon. This is the South. It's depicted by a woman. These two soldiers are representative of the military districts. That is a nice little carpet bag. Grant would be that Republican who's going down south to take over. You have two little sections here. This says the halls of justice. I know you can't read it. In my copy, I can. This is the North. How do you know a war was fought? You have a military camp here. And this is the halls of justice, a nice white building and a beautiful steamship. This is the North. Well, what does the South look like? Building is burned down. They lost the war. There's a really small military encampment. This building is burned down and their ship is sinking. So this shows the Northerners who are controlling the South during Civil War. Or I'm sorry, during Reconstruction, right? So stay tuned. Hope this helps you, and we'll see you for the end of Reconstruction.